Hello everyone, welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're enjoying your Sunday so far. What are typical triggers for INFJs? Things that if they're said, if they're manifested in some way, we tend to just lose our shit, lose our cool. Yeah, this video won't be for kids, don't worry. I always select that option. What are triggers? What are our main triggers? That's an interesting topic, and it's a topic that I don't think I've quite discussed this way. Because as we'll see in a second, there's a difference between, if you like, the triggers for the INFJ and the sort of events that may lead an INFJ to just banish you from their life altogether. It's not the same thing. But let's see this in a minute. If you want to understand the INFJ type a bit better, don't forget you can get my book, The Ecstatic Soul. If you'd want to deepen your understanding, the link is below. Ebook, paperback. You can also get my book, The Infinite Castle, by the way. It's a novel. Get it. Support my channel. If you're into Kafka, Dostoevsky, Murakami, and if you're interested in INFJ fictional main character, this might be interesting to you. You can also support me on Patreon. Any support is greatly appreciated. It helps the channel. If you want me to continue producing content, that helps. Okay, so triggers. Like I was saying, if you really observe people, something that you'll notice is that there's two ways in which you can really ruffle someone's feathers. You can trigger them in the sense of just saying something that makes them really lose it, or at least makes them lose their cool, and it's noticeable, and their tone changes, they can become more aggressive. There's just a marked change of register compared to what you've naturally grown to expect from them, right? So it's a deviation from expectation, and I call it that. The other way in which you can really ruffle someone's feathers might on the surface appear less intense in terms of a reaction, maybe colder, maybe more distant, right? So it's not markedly emotional, if you like, not necessarily, but it might have much more long-term consequences. So this latter category is what I would typically call the NI banishment, which, if you are unfamiliar with the concept, you may refer to my video, which is called NI banishment, which is a suggested reinterpretation of the INFJ door slam. And if I were to just provide a very quick picture, and again, this is not going to be the main focus of this video, the reason why it's not equivalent to being triggered, I think, for an INFJ, is that NI banishment usually is something that whose initial cause is a deep feeling of unease and discomfort with what often another person has done. The INFJ is confused, and they're confused because, and I refer you to the video where I discuss the fact that INFJs are holistic beings and that they have holistic, as per this hypothesis, a holistic mental framework where all the parts have to fit together and such as to form a coherent whole, which is regulated at the top by the NI function, where everything has to make sense together. If there's a new part that is added to the mental framework, it has to be validated by the whole. Difference from what the NESI people do, ENTPs, INTPs, and so on, where an extraneous piece of content, whether it be an event or something someone says, can be aggregated without having to necessarily be sanctioned or validated by the whole. So you can talk of a holistic mental framework versus a more atomistic mental framework. Each have their strengths, each have their weaknesses. Holistic tends to have a strong sense of direction to it, can really focus on a project for long periods, but it's less adaptable to new content, whereas the atomistic one, more adaptable, in some sense more open to that strangeness of new content, less likely to have this very strong sort of unified drive. One of the difficulties for the INFJ's holistic framework is that when you do something that's just shocking to them, they won't be triggered because first they need to kind of figure out what's going on. But often when they have figured out if you like, the new mental elements they might have to come up with to preserve the integrity of the whole is to basically exclude you from their immediate social circle. So the banishment is something that is initially shocked or confused, and then a cool, some might say cold and calculated process of readjustments of which you might be the victim. Now, triggers. Triggers are different because, if you're online particularly, but also if you're in everyday conversation with people, you'll notice that sometimes people they switch sometimes quite quickly from a state of being perfectly normal, rational, and so on. You're just having conversation with them and it's great, to them just losing their rationality and becoming very emotional and aggressive and infantile sometimes. And I say this with all the love in the world because, I can be triggered. No problem. You can trigger me if you want. Now, sometimes they won't have this infantile kind of behavior, but certainly their register will change. They might switch from being quite an agreeable person to just saying something very harsh and very final and very abrupt. So there's something that clearly indicates that a nerve was touched, right? A nerve was touched. And of course, when a nerve is touched, it's very painful. So the trigger is immediate. It's not like the case of the door slam, or like I prefer to call it, the NI banishment, the holistic mind, the readjustment, and so on. It's a different process. It's much more immediate, much more spontaneous, and much more, if you like, it's much more irrationally motivated, even though the garb of it, the cover of it, when it's expressed, can come across as rational. It's always going to be a change of register that will surprise people and confuse them as well. Like, okay, what's going on with this person? Different people have different triggers, and certainly triggers transcend your type, your type belonging in many ways. But I think to the extent that there are INFJ triggers, one trigger that I want to mention, to be completely honest with you, initially I began by just extrapolating from my own experience without being quite certain that this would apply to everybody's experience. And I'm still not sure that it applies to everybody's experience, everybody that identifies as INFJ, that is. But I think that there is a contingent within the INFJ population that will relate to this kind of trigger. And it leads me to hypothesize other things as well regarding other types. So this video is also relevant to other people from other types. So I think this trigger has to do with the FE function. And the way in which it is manifested is often that an INFJ will be triggered if what is questioned is not necessarily their cognitive ability, it's not necessarily their prescience, the visionary ability, which I think prescience is a much better term for, but it's more the questioning of their of their moral probity. In other words, their moral honesty, the integrity of their ethical stance. It's not something that INFJs might be focusing on the most in their everyday interests, in their everyday conversations, but I just think it's a nerve for them when you question that. So if you have an intellectual conversation with an INFJ and you call them dumb, I don't think it's going to trigger them. If you have a conversation with INFJ and if you call them sort of the opposite of visionary, whatever that means, you're not able to see the big picture, INFJs might think that you're dumb. They won't be triggered by that because it's a zone where, to them it's so obvious that they can see the big picture. It's just so part of their everyday that you're not gonna make them feel insecure. It's just a zone where they're too secure anyway to be made insecure. Note that the ability to see the big picture is not equivalent to the ability to see the big picture in the right way, but to switch to the big picture, regardless of what the final result is something that is so normal for INFJs that you're not going to trigger them. And I think the reason why you want to trigger them so much if you question their cognitive ability is that this is just not something that they prioritize. You know, some INFJs might prioritize it, but they won't organize their whole self-worth around it. So on the one hand, you have, like, if you like, maybe the TI aspect of things that they don't organize their self-worth about. And then you have the NI aspect of things, the more visionary aspect of things, the big picture aspect of things, where they do organize their self-identity around it, but it's just this strong pillar of it, you know, that you're not gonna discombobulate them by calling it into question. It might amuse them more than anything. With FE, however, there seems to be a point, there seems to be a nerve there. It's in my case, and this is the case of other INFJs I've observed. I'm not going to say all INFJs. For example, the ones I call pure processing INFJs are so deeply buried in their NI that they might not notice. But for those INFJs that are not pure processing, that have an FE function that they care about manifesting it, they care to develop it, nurture it. They think it's important to their lives. They've read this book and they agree that it's important to their lives, you know, the FE function, the way into the social world, integration, de-alienation, enlightenment, and so on. I think that for some reason, if you question their moral integrity, you're in a conversation, you don't tell them that they're stupid. You don't say through the energy, tell them, okay, you're dumb. I'm not going to trigger them. If you tell them you're not dumb, but you're not honest in your intellectual position, that might well trigger them. Triggers me. So if you want to, if you want to trigger me in the future, you know what to do. Of course, if I know that you saw this video, maybe I'll be prepared. But what I mean to say is that why is that this has to do with the FE function. One possible path of interpretation, but you may well enrich it in your comments to this video. This is not something that I'm writing on in the current manuscript, by the way. It's a video I think is interesting to do anyway. Is that it seems to me that it's really interesting to me that FI leads, FI dominants like ISFPs or INFPs, you'd expect that they could be very triggered if you were to question their moral authenticity. And I think that it's the opposite. It's like, if you question the moral authenticity of an ISFP or an INFP, I think that they're more likely to just banish you in some way, but not be triggered as such. And I think that the reason why they're not triggered as such is that FI is not really a function that requires validation from the external tribe. It's not a function that requires public validation. Now, FE is a function that interacts with a certain level of public approval and public validation. It's in the nature of being extroverted feeling, right? When someone calls you intellectually dishonest, at least when someone calls me intellectually dishonest, I'm never more triggered than if this is said in the presence of other people, if it's said publicly. I think that if it's said privately, I can sort of defend myself and I won't like it, but I will be more triggered if it's said publicly. And I think that's because the fact that this is said publicly is a direct challenge to the public perception of my right and moral use of the FE function. I think that's why it is triggering. But it's also triggering because insofar as it's extroverted, I can't control it completely. It's not dominant like NI, so it's not exactly my world where I just am comfortable regardless. It's not like TI and SE, which are valued but not as highly as FE. Right? So FE is sufficiently valued that we care a lot about it, but it's extroverted, so we're not in control of the public validation of it. And that's why I think it being questioned can be such a trigger, can make us so angry. But let me know in the comments what you think, because maybe you have a different experience, and I'd be really interested to hear what kind of triggers you have as an INFJ. Of course, if talking about a trigger is triggering for you, don't do it, okay? But if it's not, yeah, it'd be really interesting to discuss that in the comments and see where it goes. Okay, guys, hope that was interesting. I'll see you on Wednesday, okay? Take care. Don't forget about Patreon, by the way, because it really helps. You know, like for my manuscripts, I have to read material, I have to get books, it's a lot of effort. So consider it. Okay, take care.